whenever you're invited to a conference, you have to send a title and an abstract, sometimes months before you actually do the presentation. So this was a bit of a wild card, but it actually does derive from the fact that I think we're very short on metaphors in this day. And we're facing huge global crises, and all we can talk about are things like sustainability and net zero. And they're so unevocative, they're not emotive, they're not gorgeous, they're not memorable. And I love the term rewilding, because actually I feel very strongly that the situation is not one that we can just deal with by cutting emissions and future-proofing and going on doing everything as we've always done it. And rewilding the white cube gives that sense that we need to rejuvenate, regenerate. We need to, build richness and diversity into our institutions if they are going to survive into the future and the future of our audiences. But I'm also very conscious that I'm coming to an exquisite, beautiful modernist museum in a small town, and everything is perfect here. And I come from a huge, messy, messed up kind of an organization that is on the brink of chaos continuously because of the intersection of so many crises, with climate, with COVID, with race, climates of equity. And so what I'm talking about is very different, I think, from the local context here, but I have always found it so interesting and useful to talk to colleagues in very different contexts, and I've learned from that. So I hope my experience, which is about my museum, not the museum, will hopefully be of interest today. And Christina did there's my museum, deeply embedded in the climate crisis. That's before we even dreamt of that it could become our museum, belching out smoke over the city of London. And that's the museum now, the power station transformed, and of course the Blavatnik building, which was the addition, that did it on its own. Christina? Shall we just see? Okay, maybe it's okay. But what I wanted to start, Christina did a great resume of my career, I think. Christina did a great resume of my career, thank you very much. And so you will know that I sort of began as an art historian and became a curator, then became somebody who worked for 20 years on the Tate Modern project. Then I was working with a collection for many years in an ambitious way. And then for the last 7 years, I've been director of Tate Modern. And I wanted, and my last kind of project for Tate Modern, to kind of go back to the beginning. And of course, my beginnings in art history were with the sort of foundational figures of modernism. And one of those figures was Mondrian. And this exhibition came about because the Kunstmuseum Den Haag approached us and asked us if we'd like to partner on an exhibition that would look at a very known artist, Mondrian, and a very recently known artist, recently discovered pioneer of abstraction, Hilma af Klint. And they wanted to do that with us through the lens of spirituality. And we wanted to open that up because of our work in relation to climate emergency and ecology, and think of their work through a double lens, a conjoined lens, the lens of spirituality and nature. And of course, both Mondrian and af Klint shared a common start in life. So they shared a continent and a time frame and an era. And more specifically, they shared a deep interest in and a personal engagement with nature and spirituality. And you can see that in their parallel projects, great big ambitious projects to explore evolution, for example, in their work. And then a lifelong commitment to working from literally observation from nature. Hilma af Klint looking at wildflowers, and Mondrian throughout his life, even parallel with his great late abstract paintings, making very detailed observational paintings from cultivated flowers. But the kind of siloed nature of modernist art history, that we focus on style and aesthetics and the formal qualities sort of disassociated with biography or context, means that kind of art history has almost willfully suppressed Mondrian's engagement with nature or spirituality, the occult, but it also has situated and continues to situate af Klint kind of as an outsider artist. So our argument was that by recontextualizing both artists into the complex era of their time, it's possible to legitimately and with some value, some interest, open up Mondrian's work to a different kind of complexity and to bring auf Klimt back into a rewilded and expanded world. It opened the conversation, the story of art up. And of course, both artists, like the best storytellers, contributed to a generational coming to terms with really fundamental aspects of human experience. And this was an age of incredible scientific innovation and discovery. So attitudes to time and nature in a rapidly changing industrialized world that was globally connected. And in doing the research around the exhibition, we looked at as many maps we could that would tell us what the world looked at during their foundational years. And of course, when you begin to look at this map and you think remind yourself of Alfred Barr's map of kind of canonical modern art history, you realize that the world actually was interconnected. And it's impossible to limit the sources, the inspiration, the connections, the kind of ether of their work to a particular and narrowly based time frame. So that shared understanding of kind of cosmic connections between life on Earth and transcendental, linking humanity with nature, their thinking shaped by scientific and technological inventions, really spoke to us not just of their time, but the way that artists and institutions intersect with our own time. And that pairing of Hilma af Klimt and Mondrian was partly rooted in the dynamic rethinking of art history that Tate Modern has been part of since its inception in the year 2000. So the pairing is something that we've been playing with for over 2 decades. But the way we thought about this particular pairing and how we curated this exhibition, I think was very profoundly shaped by our involvement in conversations and actions that were specifically around climate and ecological emergency, and actually demonstrate the fact that we could not contain that conversation and within the actions and urgencies of achieving net zero. The thing is bigger than that. So everything changed. Well, Tate's direct. I have to first of all, pay tribute to an amazing team at Tate Modern and the architects Herzog and de Meuron, who we worked with from 2007 in developing our new building known as the Blavatnik building. And they set out, a long time ago, to make a building that was ambitious in terms of its sustainability, the materials it used, the technologies it folded, and some of the ways it came to challenge the kind of visitor journey through the building. So that was carried out by a small team of architects and estate workers, begun in 2007 when they started benchmarking, but incrementally built on year. But it was something that did not engage the rest of the institution. It was really about bricks and mortar and electricity, solar panels. But what happened in 2019 was that a group of artists came to Tate Modern and asked whether we could have a conversation. And those artists and activists, and you can see them here, were a group self-made group called Culture Declares. And this was at the moment a really heightened activity across the UK and Europe of Extinction Rebellion, big public demonstrations, a lot of activism. So it was a very kind of febrile moment, and temperatures were really, really high. And they approached us and asked us, as the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, to take a leadership role in officially declaring a climate and ecological emergency. And it seems sort of bizarre now because, I don't think anybody in this room would feel you had to declare, but at that moment, it felt that we had to make not just a declaration, but to use our institutional heft and bring it to the advocacy that the artists were doing, and to make real our mission statement that art and artists are at the core of everything we do. And there was a sense of urgency and agency. And these artists represented an important constituency for us. Some of them were working with us on exhibitions. Cornelia Parker was coming up to a great show at Tate Britain. Others were in the collection. Others were artist educators with us, and they also brought with them a small group of really committed commercial gallery directors, some journalists, so it was very kind of public, and members of related activist groups. And it was impressive, passionate, and really articulate, and compelling, and very effective. I felt a really strong degree of empathy with them, and of course, growing concern. And we were very keenly aware that this group of artists were forcing us, by sitting around the table and confronting us, to ask very difficult questions, the kind of questions that institutions often find very difficult to ask of themselves. And that led to a declaration, as I said, of climate emergency, which we made just a few months later in July of 2019. And it really contains three elements. One is, of course, a pledge to reduce our carbon footprint and to set a target to reach net zero, to align ourselves with British governmental, other people's goals, to come on board and say we would make the necessary steps. But there was also a pledge to interrogate our systems, our values, and our programs. And this had come about because it wasn't just about net zero. The artists were asking, why were we continuing with the kind of programs that we'd always continued with? Why were our bookshops serving a particular kind of audience? Why was the food that we were serving in our restaurants, et cetera, et cetera? So it was a whole range of concerns around sustainability in absolutely the broadest sense. And then, of course, there was the lens was that we should do all this through the lens of the communities and the audiences that we serve. So there were three elements, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through each one. And the first one, of course, which is around our carbon footprint, is in some ways the easiest to talk about because it's an area where you can capture data. So this data comes from an audit that we took place in 2019 with a consultancy, a charity called Julie's Bicycle, specifically charged by the Arts Council in the UK to support cultural organisations in their journey to net zero. So they came in and looked at all our data, interviewed many people, and came up with a kind of report and a set of figures and a set of recommendations. And of course, what you see here is that I'm sure you all know everything about Scope 1 and Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions, but the Scope 1 and 2 emissions are the ones that are immediately in your control. And for an institution like Tate, the really big ones there are around the power that generates your building. For us, it was electricity and gas. And then the Scope 3 emissions, which are the much more difficult ones they're slippery. They're the things where you hire in services or you're hiring in materials. Some were easy and straightforward to identify: office paper, you know how much you're using, staff commuting, you know where your staff are traveling. But a huge amount lay under this sort of this blue part called procurement. That's all the stuff you do when you bring in exhibitions and the materials you buy and the lighting engineers and all that stuff. And so it was their strong recommendation that we should transition our power to green power, but we should really, really look at procurement being the sort of like a really elusive, unknown area. But so that's the carbon footprint in Tate's direct control. Of course, what they also pointed out, and this is the sort of white elephant for a museum like Tate Modern, is that 92% of our entire carbon footprint it sits within visitor travel. We have 5 to 6 million visitors a year at Tate Modern, 8 million to Tate as a whole, and over 50% of those visitors will come from abroad and many from long-haul destinations. And that data has been incredibly significant in us thinking about who is the museum for. Of course, I love the fact that tourists come, because you can come to Tate Modern from Paris, Berlin, Istanbul, Cairo, or wherever, and have a transformative experience that will affect your life and your place. And yet, it's a huge carbon footprint that's also tied into our financial sustainability. So that's something that Tate and other institutions like Tate really has to think about in the future, because it ties up with that putting audiences and communities at the forefront. Is it our community, all communities? Who is our audience? Which is the audience we privilege? So working with Julie's Bicycle, we came up with 10 actions to reduce emissions, and I'm sure all of you who run museums, who work in them, these will feel very familiar. Energy management strategies, improving building energy, removing gas, renewable electricity from suppliers, adding additional capacity onto the grid, thinking about key suppliers, demonstrating good environmental practices, etc., etc., etc. And then just a few illustrations of how Tate has done subsequently. Tate did switch to renewable energy in 2019, so it's 100% renewable resources now, but we've at the same time massively lowered energy consumption by upgrading obsolete machinery, cooling machinery, for example, lighting controls. The Blavatnik building, as I said earlier, has a really interesting system of cooling by natural ventilation, which means it's jolly cold a lot of the time, but the galleries themselves are at pitch temperatures. The thermal mass is cooled using overnight temperature drop, and the coils remove heat from the floor. We also have installed solar panels on our roofs, LED lighting across the galleries, and just in the bottom bit of this here, we are now closely monitoring water usage and harvesting rainwater for our grey water activities like flushing toilets. Lots of other things, it's all on our website, but there's sort of whole range of things. We've innovated in the way we store and transport art. We use sustainable wood. We've taken down our temperature and humidity conditions in our galleries, which is quite a dramatic thing to do for other institutions, and we're trying to work with other international partners to do the same. We're working with CMAM and BISO on international green museum principles for collection care. Recycled packaging in our shops, t-shirts made from renewable cotton, all lost property goes to charity, all our food waste is collectible at our back door by impoverished people on Friday mornings. We make our own honey. I mean, if you could rewild your roof, you could make honey. It's very good honey. We have beehives at Tate Modern and Tate Britain, and we recycle approximately 75% of our waste. All that we can't is diverted from landfill to produce energy. And all that has been extraordinary work of a very tiny team within the estates team. But things that I've been involved with over recent years are setting up a virtual courier scheme so that we no longer have to send people when we send works of art, which is a huge saving in terms of air miles, and that's working incredibly well. It requires, consideration and care and trust with other organizations, but so far so good, and that's now rolling out to many of our partnership museums who we lend to and borrow from. And exhibition builds, so the whole look of exhibitions is changing at Tate Modern. We try to use the architecture as is. It's not as beautiful as this building, but there is a basic choreography of the building that we now use rather than reconstructing for every exhibition. And where possible, we are using materials that can either be recycled or go back into the world from which they came. So this is an installation from the making of Rodin in 2021, where all the wood came from the building industry, and all went back into the building industry. And then the bits that were left over were then recycled into this large-scale children's project at Uniqlo Tate Play Dream Buildings. So all that coming together has given us some good news, which is being released in the quarterly reports, the most recent quarterly reports, and that is that Tate has achieved its goal of a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 23. So this year we've made it from that baseline in 2007 to 8. And we are now working towards reducing carbon emissions to net zero by 2030. But of course, carbon emissions aren't the only thing that we need to do. And 50%, I think, is probably achieved by picking off the low-hanging fruit, but the next 50% will be really tough. But the broader aims that I wanted to talk about that came from acknowledging climate change and the need to respond cannot be separated from issues that affect all our daily lives. And of course, those issues are shaped by agendas of wealth and health, local and global distribution of resources, and agendas of racial and gender inequality and access to culture. And in London now, confronting climate emergency at Tate Modern, those agendas slotted into existing and equally strong strategic commitments to build relationships of confidence and trust with audiences beyond the traditionally privileged educational elite. When I became director in 2016, it was one of the things I inherited from my predecessor, Chris Durkon, was a kind of commitment and passion and feeling of necessity to diversify our audience and actually serve the communities of the bit of London in which Tate Modern sits, and it's a poor neighbourhood. Southwark, Lambeth are amongst the poorer boroughs in London, and they are also among the most diverse. So there's a very large South Asian communities, Afro-Caribbean, many families of Afro-Caribbean descent, large recent immigrant populations. And because it's always been a part of London that served the city of London on the other side of the river with all its wealth, it's the poor neighbourhood where the workers lived and slept, and where the pubs and the bars and the brothels were to service the city of London. And as I took on the directorship, that time coincided with the publication of two really important reports on, in a way, the state of the nation reports on the health of arts institutions. And one of them was prepared by the University of Warwick in the UK, and it specifically looked at British cultural institutions, and it identified and documented growing evidence of a huge mismatch between the public's taste and their interests and the publicly funded cultural offer. And we were a national museum, publicly funded. And this they identified as a crisis of relevance, as well as accessibility. So the idea that cultural institutions were simply not seen as relevant, interesting, important organizations in many people's lives. And there were two interesting pieces of data that came with that report, or that I found really interesting. And that's that the public for public institutions in the UK was very significantly weighted towards a highly engaged minority, university educated, and in professional occupations. And there was a data that indicated a very sharp decline in recent years in children taking part in all areas of cultural activity, driven by a lack of access to, and significantly by a lack of opportunities to participate. And that data was very strongly replicated in our own audience research. And of course, there were lots of reasons for the disaffection and for children, interest falling off. One big cause would have been our own government's withdrawal from the cultural offer and the increasing financial squeeze on institutions that made it very difficult for institutions like mine to privilege public programs over programs that would make money for the institution, because of course Tate's a public museum, but only 35% of its income comes from public sources. That ICOM definition, I have to say, is sort of drives one mad as a director. The idea that we have to do all this, we do try. So that was one report, and it confirmed what we thought, but it also was deeply worrying. The other report, which came from a different position, was from the Gulbenkian Foundation, its inquiry into the civic role of arts organizations. This was interesting. It kind of proposed 5 civic roles for arts organizations to aim towards if they were going to be taken into the future by audiences. 1, as colleges, so places of learning. 2, as town halls, these are their terms, so places of debate. Thirdly, as parks, so public spaces open to everyone. Then as temples, so places which give meaning and provide solace. And finally, as homes, so places of safety and belonging. And actually that particular combination of roles do give arts organizations a unique edge over any other organizations with missions to achieve social change, because the potential there to engender hope. We can be homely, we can be playful, we can be joyous. We're safe places for discussion, we're shelters, and we have the potential to inspire. So I had these two sort of competing, desperately depressing info from the Warwick report, then incredibly inspiring metaphors for how to do it from the Gulbenkian. And early on in my tenure, I was asked by a journalist, I was wrong-footed, as they say, to describe my vision for the museum. And of course, I had a vision, but it wasn't a journalistic vision. So I described my vision as a university with a playground attached. And actually, I've really, 7 years on, I still like that definition, because it suggests that you can retain your deep knowledge, your scholarship, your expertise, your place in history, but you can also feed it into play that everybody can become involved in. Of course, play, it's the origins of play and leisure come from the Greek word for school, and learning begins with play. So if one thinks of the sort of arc of life and cultural involvement, it has to begin with play. Hopefully it'll end in research. It's not mandatory, but I love that idea that we institutions can have that scope. And at a time when all around we're being told to make really populist programs, that it is possible to do serious, engaging programs that also have broad reach. But so those reports were really foundational in shaping my program, and also in the way we then responded to climate and ecological emergency as a kind of the coming together of many emergencies that would require from us and our audiences a kind of shifting of the mindset. And I just will run through a number of the projects that I particularly associate with this thinking. Of course, business as usual went on, but there were some standout projects for me. We worked with Tania Bruguera, the Cuban activist, on a turbine hall commission, and her idea was really not to make much art, but to work with community, a self-elected group of people, the Tate neighbors, to make visible, tangible change in the way we worked with community. And it was a very tough project. She found a group of neighbors, we paid them, they came together, they were a group of solidarity. They included people who'd been in activist roles acting against Tate, Liberate Tate, for example, and we had to meet them on a number of occasions. And on each occasion, they put up, asked us impossible demands. They wanted to appoint one of them, their number, as a trustee. They wanted to be present at ethics committees. And they wanted to take down the name of Len Blavatnik from our building. And this was, of course, impossible to do, but as so often happens when you work with artists and they ask you difficult questions, you think about things from a different point of view. So the answer to could we take the name of Len Blavatnik, who'd given us £50 million, the building was named in his honor. If we could take his name off the building was not to say, no, we can't have not that we can't work with you, but it was, we can actually put the name of one of your number on another building. And out of that came the naming of our original building, the Natalie Bell building, after a local social worker. She was voted by the community as the person that they would like to honor with her name on a building. And overnight, she did what all of us in the institution had been trying to think about for many years. How do we make visible our commitment, our equal commitment, or the equity with which we value financial investment and social investment in our buildings? And it was a really perfect and wonderful project. But it was also one of those projects that you can, you think of as a trigger project. It lots of things came out of it. It was, I suppose, acted like what systems analysts call like a leverage point. Things happened, a small shift in one area, just the name put on a building can produce big changes. And it was the beginning of real deep engagement with very local people who became part of our advisory group and are still asking and telling us what to do. And we try where we can to accommodate their ambitions. And it's been an amazing journey. It allowed us to do this. It allowed us during COVID to realize that we had to serve those people by bringing in vaccinations to them. And we were able to turn the Turbine Hall into, working with the NHS, into a vaccination center. Being a good neighbor means exactly this, but it also means being welcoming and being a social space as well as a space for art. So a space where people can gather and actually just do, a different kind of cultural activity inside and outside the building. And it meant also a place that the children in the neighborhood could learn to walk and learn to draw. And ever since that time, we've made a major spatial commitment, if not financial, to putting young people's activities absolute to the fore. So it's not in a room on the side or upstairs, it's right occupying the space that we do our big commissions in. And this was a really extraordinary project in 2021, and the evidence coming out of these big projects, which is completely mind-blowing, is that these projects drive diversity more powerfully than any other project that we've ever done. And so this is how we approach that desperate information in the Warwick report. The other reason we need to do it, of course, is this, that resilience and future-proofing means building a local audience, an audience that can walk to you and not need to get a plane. And that will bring down those Scope 3 emissions in the long run. But we also need to the idea that the institution can be a place of debate. So we create, through works of art, spaces of debate. Richard Bell's Embassy, his tent that he started, kicked off in 1992 to discuss land rights and resource ownership, was in London for 4 months earlier this year. And we also need programs that really look at the burning issues of their time. So Cara Walker's commission in the Turbine Hall looked at the whole history of British Empire and British history's embeddedness in extractive industries, in the slave trade, and its presence in our contemporary lives. Actually all in a form that was 100% recyclable. Another Hyundai commission, Cecilia Vicuna, of course, taking our communities in making contact with other communities. So this project looked at the ghost forests around the world, particularly the loss of biodiversity in the Amazon, but working with Latinx communities in London and building these wonderful hangings, both with wool garnered from Wales and Scotland, but with bones and elements found on the shores of the Thames outside Tate Modern. So these projects do matter. Those narratives are really important. The narratives on display in this exhibition here are really important. And as Rebecca Solnit has argued recently, every crisis is partly a crisis of storytelling, because if we told the stories correctly, we'd know what was going on. But it's our responsibility to make those stories visible and tangible. It is an awesome responsibility. And I think it's also crucial to show, as in a project like this with Jenny Holtz, that we too are quite scared. So that's something that, you know, we share with our communities, but also that art can point to futures that we might not have thought of otherwise. It's a wonderful project around sort of technology and future biodiversity by Annika Yee, In Love with the World. And of course, then we can work with artists to make real changes in our institutions. And I mentioned Tanya Bruguera and the naming of the Natalie Bell building, but this is a little project, seemingly little project with a collaborative called Cooking Sections, who made a show at Tate Britain. And as part of their exhibition, they asked whether we would have the courtesy to take farmed salmon off our menus for the duration, because they are activists in this area, working with producers of bivalves, of mussels and oysters in Scotland. And this too was a gateway action, a trigger to very profound change in the way we source our foods. We took salmon off the menu. We've never brought it back. 28 plus Tate partners followed suit, and many international institutions have followed. So an extraordinary result from a really very small intervention into the programme. And that is the community up in Scotland that they work with. But I know it's very easy to throw a PowerPoint together of charismatic images and, you know, share great statistics about emission targets. So I wanted just to mess things up a tiny little bit, because of course all of this happens within a really complicated organization, and organizations are very, very difficult to change. Their structures, their people, their systems, and I think many of the organizations that underpin, that shape, that lead our society, our politics, our institutions of learning are really, you know, past their sell-by date. So just thinking about my organization, this is a little thing that I did by adapting a plan created by our head of research, who was wanting to put research into the discourses of the Art Museum. I've taken research out actually and put the public in at the bottom, the discourse of democratic participation, given that we are a university and a playground. But these are the four things, the four sort of governing agents, the things that really the institution, once you take that ICOM definition and you say, well, which bit of the institution delivers which bits of the definition? There's the discourse around governance. So this is your mission statement, your ethics, the things that you'll bring you to real trouble if you don't play by the rules. And sometimes they are at odds with the thing on the other side, the discourse of financial sustainability. You know, much of the cash we could chase, we could get, comes from sources that are questionable, whether they're Russian oligarchs or fossil fuel companies. And it's governance who has to tell finance that we can't do that. The discourse of artists and the collection is absolutely core. It's right in the middle of that ICOM definition. And sometimes what artists want us to do is very difficult. Tanya Bruguera wanted us to put an artist, one of her community members, on the board of governance, and that just wasn't possible. She wanted us to spend money on other things. That wasn't possible, but we found another way of working with her. And then, of course, the discourse of democratic participation. If we really wanted to democratize the museum, the whole museum would be free. we would have always on activities of that type that I've showed you, the highly engaging, mass participatory making, the projects that develop cognitive development and community and families adore. But of course, they come up against the problem of we need to earn lots and lots of money. And we do have to do that through blockbuster exhibitions, and blockbuster exhibitions don't actually serve the discourse of artists in the collection because they serve the interests of very, very small number of very famous artists. So it's a complicated structure to negotiate. And there are lots of tensions. Most of the tensions, of course, are around finance, because what sustains us as an institution is not necessarily the projects that sustain our, our hearts and our minds. And at Tate, I would say that everything we have to date achieved in terms of, the things that we're all proud of, the opening of Tate Modern, the taking out chronology from our displays, the building of the international collection, they've only happened as a result of growth. And so, we began with one museum, British art and a bit of international art. It was in the capital. We wanted to have a foothold. We wanted to be in the regions. So we built 2 museums. We wanted to become an international museum. We built a 4th. And the same thing has happened with the collection, of which I do feel rightly proud. I ran it for 10 years. I spearheaded this development from a European and American model to a very internationally ground transnational collection, which was very important to serve our increasingly global demographic in London. But this is what it looks like now. A tiny collection, tiny amount of work on display, and this huge hidden, the bulk of it, vast proportions under the surface. And if you're worried about it now, this is a bit of research that I did around what's it going to, if we continue acquiring at the same rate, where will we be in 2,499 at the moment? When we first started, just before Tate Modern, I think we were able to show at any time 50% of our collection. And 40%, no, hang on, I'm getting confused now. It was about 50-50. Even if we continue rotating the displays at the rapid rate we do, in 100 and how many years is that? I can't do maths. There's a lot of years, isn't it? We will never, ever, ever, in my lifetime, your lifetime, the lifetime of our youngest artists, or possibly their children, we will never show a very significant proportion of the collection that we own, which is in public ownership. So it is in effect a very, very private, publicly owned collection. At the same time, if we want to store it and keep it for future generations and care for it in the way ICON would like us to, that's what we're going to need. On the left-hand side is our storage now. In 68, that's 50 years' time, that's what we're going to need. It's kind of mind-blowing when one's thinking about sustainability, and that everything we've done, all the wonderful things, this is the real cost of what Tate has achieved. So how do you think about that? There is no route map to follow. And in the last few years, I've been talking to economists and trying to think about what would it look like? How can we make there's no Alfred Barr. Come back, Alfred Barr. We need you. We need somebody to give us maps and guidance and a way of visualizing the world. And this I found really helpful. This is an image of a donut by an amazing economist called Kate Raworth, whose book, if I can remember what it's called, is called something like Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Economist. And simply recognizing what we all know, I think we all know, that the planet faces a crisis of existential proportions, in large part driven by expansionist behaviors. And she argues that we need a more holistic and ambitious goal than net zero, because actually net zero is not going to stop the expansion. You can still expand and sort of achieve net zero somehow weirdly, but we can't all expand and achieve we are all collectively overshooting the planetary limits. So she's asking us, all of us, governments, local authorities, families, institutions, to think about our own donuts. Where is what we're doing overshooting the limits of what the planet can cope with? And at the middle of the donut, that hole, is where are we underperforming in relation to our kind of social foundations? Where are we letting people down in their social lives? Where are we overshooting, which means we're going to kill them in the long run? And it's a really interesting model to put this on top of the four discourses. And it begins to make one very scared, but also to think about how the beginnings of asking the right questions that might help us get into a future place. So she suggests we focus less on growth and more on redistribution and regeneration. And so what would that look like in terms of my museum? What if, for example, if we started collecting less, or we collected less but more strategically? What would it mean to redistribute our collection? There are many museums in the UK who don't have collections. What would it mean perhaps to deaccession work, the work that we know perhaps will never show? What if we were to do less blockbusters and show more collection in our building? I think these are questions that we all have to ask. And I think we also need to think about the blockbuster model. This is our absolute core activity on our own income generator. As I said, it's a huge driver of income, but it is a massive overshooter. I don't expect you to read all of this now, but a Tate Modern exhibition with complex loans from international lenders is almost, well, at least 20% more carbon consuming than a collection tour that we just take from one crossroad to a European venue. There's a very stark choice here in the kind of programs we make. And again, blockbuster exhibitions are absolutely honeypot for institutions like mine in attracting those international visitors. And this is, our carbon footprint without visitors is 20,000, with 260,000. It's a huge difference. If we want to take control, we have to think about that. And of course, as I said, if I had my way, I would have spent more on those kind of immersive audience building programs. And this just shows you very vividly the way the expenditure chunks up in an institution like Tate. 82% of the income goes into the activities that drive income. The Tate Exchange program, which was our pioneer learning program before COVID, 4%. That was the 4% income was designed to drive diversifying our whole audience. It doesn't make sense. This is something that, working with the Kate Raworth medal, you begin to understand what's at stake and possibly what needs to change. I think what Kate is asking us to do, and other people like Kate, many people are really asking us to put considerations of climate impacts in that wider sense into every decision we make, not just the decisions about our service providers and our electricity. And of course, as public institutions, trusted, we hope, by our audiences and communities, we will be called to account if we fail to achieve those targets, and our audience will simply disappear. And that will be another form of unsustainability. So we need to act on all fronts to demonstrate responsibility and stay relevant. And to do this, we need to think and act ecologically. Renewing and forging connections is to drive change through adaptation, enrichment, regeneration, so rewilding rather than growth. And I just wanted to end with a little note, and I suppose a nod and of respect to our artists and the way artists are really at the forefront of all the changes that we make. And this is an image of a work by Philippa Barlow, who died very recently, installed in the sculpture garden outside the building of Chileda Liku, where her last exhibition takes place. And the exhibition was installed after she died by her team. But this work was installed where she had identified where she wanted it. And she increasingly in the last few years, and you saw this in her show, the Schwitters Prize exhibition in Hanover, she was wrestling with the dilemma of overproduction in her last years. And she was painfully aware that the wonderful, incredible public exposure that her vast projects got when they were on exhibition would be followed by years, decades, maybe millennia of cold, dark storage. And she also wrestled with the restrictions imposed on her work by museums, who seemed to care more for protecting her work with barriers and light levels than about the public's experience of them. And so her answer was actually to rethink the idea of longevity. What about allowing works of art, she thought, the optimum conditions of light and space, welcome to the exposure of the seasons, allow them to be seen by multitudes, to be touched by anybody who wanted to touch them. And as time went on, she mused, they would enjoy the patina of age, express their material vulnerability, fall apart, and fade back into the world having lived a good life. So I think artists are showing the way, and therein, Philip de Barlo's work, maybe there's a model for us museums. Thank you.